Thanks for having me, Ash.
Considering Australia's war crime laws, what sort of punishment can those involved expect to face?
So what we've seen come out of the report are allegations of two specific crimes, so unlawful killing of civilians or prisoners and also cruel treatment. So they would fall under our federal legislation of war crimes, and they would be the war crime of murder, which attracts life imprisonment, and the war crime of cruel treatment, which attracts 25 years imprisonment. So really serious offences here.
And what steps are now taken to get to the point of someone being tried?
So what's happened is that the Prime Minister has established an investigative office, including with Australian federal police officers, so they will work on actually collecting evidence, because I know we've just had this major inquiry, but its goal was not to actually collect evidence about this. However, I'm sure the investigators will draw on testimonies and other things that Brereton has actually found. So what they'll do is they'll gather evidence and then they can actually bring charges against them under our Commonwealth Criminal Code Act.
What about the commanders? What ramifications are there for those who may not have been aware of wrongdoing at the time, but who were found to have a moral responsibility, was the term that the Chief of the Defence Force used?
So this is a really interesting question, and I was intrigued at his wording. And we do actually have, under the war crimes legislation, this ability to charge people under command responsibility. And what it says is that a commander who knew or should have known that war crimes were being committed should have either taken steps to prevent them or afterwards to investigate and punish them. And so what's interesting is to say, well, we had commanders who didn't know about it, but actually the line is they should have known. And in the military hierarchy, really commanders are expected to know what their subordinates are doing at all times. That's part of the system and how it works. So I think to just say, oh, they were morally responsible, you know, is not bringing full accountability, because it was their job to know what was going on and to take steps about it. And we have heard specifically of commanders, you know, who are within the regiment who didn't do anything. So I'm really hoping that there will be command responsibility actions, you know, prosecutions under command responsibility that go forward from this.
As we know, these alleged crimes happened in theatre of war, on foreign soil. What are our obligations in the international sphere? There's the Geneva Conventions, the International Criminal Court. Will international bodies get involved?
So in terms of our obligations, we do have obligations under what's called international humanitarian law, and that's the formal term for the laws of war. And Australia is a party to the Geneva Conventions and its additional protocols. And so what we see here is actually, it's not an international armed conflict, which is a conflict between two countries. So it's a non-international armed conflict. So what would apply is what's called Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, and that does include a prohibition on the murder of civilians. And that is actually, we find that in our domestic legislation, our war crimes legislation, which is really comprehensive. And so in terms of thinking about the International Criminal Court, it's very unlikely that it would even come into play, because the ICC is a court of last resort. And so the idea is that it's the obligation of a country to actually investigate and prosecute its own personnel. And we are doing that. We have comprehensive legislation available to us to prosecute for war crimes, and we are taking the action. So as long as we do take the action, we investigate properly and we prosecute where necessary, the ICC will have absolutely no interest in these Australian soldiers.
You mentioned the Prime Minister's already appointed that special investigator to consider these criminal cases. The government's also setting up this independent oversight panel to ensure that these cultural issues that are clearly there do get addressed, as the Chief of the Defence Force wants them to be. Is that extent of oversight appropriate? Is there an argument that we need further independent scrutiny of the Defence Force?
I think what they've done so far is enough, and we'll see how that goes. But I think it is important, the fact that it's independent oversight mechanism, to have someone from outside of the Defence Force actually overseeing what's going on. Because we do know that there is a tendency within the Defence Force, because it's part of the insular culture, to essentially cover things up, and we see that directly with these alleged crimes in the report. And so it's really important to have independent oversight outside of the defence mechanism itself.
Dr. O'Brien, appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much for your time and insights.
Thank you.
And again, if you are a serving or former member of the Defence Force or a relative in need of support, you can call Open Arms on 1800 011 046, the Defence Family Helpline on 1800 624 608, or Lifeline on 131114. Moving on for now, we have seen more positive news out today from the US as Pfizer-BioNTech announced its coronavirus vaccine is better than first thought. But the White House transition is anything but smooth as President Donald Trump demands more recounts.
Pfizer shook the world last week with a vaccine it claimed was 90% effective. Today they said it's even better.
We have observed a 95% efficacy, protection from disease.
The President-elect, on a Zoom call with first responders, talked about its enormous promise.
I am optimistic, but